So our next session is going to be a really interesting one I'm actually really excited for. What it's going to be called is the Hot Takes on Hot Topics. And you're going to see on stage Drew again, Julia again, and leading the panel with them will be Nick Spitzer. And Nick is on our DBT Labs EMEA sales team, but his previous job, he actually set up and ran the BI team in a startup called Beekeeper. And he's been a long-standing member of the DBT community as well. And so he's a great personality to have on the stage here and leading this panel. Make sure you take part in the Slack. Just get onto the Slack channel, chime in with any questions, any thoughts, ideas. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And as Drew said this morning, feel free to heckle him on there. It's all in the spirit of community, so long as it's on Slack. So without further ado, I'll welcome to the stage Nick Spitzer, Julia Schottenstein, and Drew Bannon.
Do our mics work? Hello, everyone. I think there's a clicker.
Clicker's on top.
Is this it?
That's it.
Hello. As Mark said, my name is Nick Spitzer. I'm honored to moderate this panel today with the clever ones. We're going to call this Hot Takes on Hot Takes. And general premise here is there's a lot of trends and topics going on in data. And if you're not following data Twitter or reading all the Substacks or listening to all the podcasts, there's a good chance you're going to miss something. I personally missed something. Luckily, we have the resources in Julia and Drew to pay attention to what's going on with these trends. So we're gonna go into them. The general format of this session, we have about 6 topics we want to touch on. We'd ask you to hold your questions to the end or put them in our Slack. My data says there are only 203 people in our Slack channel right now, so I know some people could still get involved. So post questions in there. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end to go into questions, and we'll be happy about that. So I'm going to introduce the first topic with a tweet. And this is from the mother of data mesh. So data mesh, I'm actually not going to read the tweet because data mesh is such a big topic. Maybe show of hands, who's heard of, thinking about, or doing data mesh in their daily business? Okay, cool. Not quite half. So I hear about this all the time in my daily work right now. Maybe, Julie, maybe introduce this topic for us. What is data mesh? Is this a tooling? What is this? I don't quite get it.
Yeah, we're starting off with the spicy one, and I was also just told we're not recording this talk, so we can get pretty hot takes here. But data mesh, what is it? I'll try to give a definition. I think a lot of people disagree on a definition of the data mesh, but it's really a combination of people, process, and technology. And at its core, it's a frame for companies to think about their business units and their data domains as federated entities to make their own decisions about their data tools and their data sets. And believers of the data mesh feel that at a certain point, having a singular data store, whether it be a warehouse or a lakehouse, just fundamentally doesn't scale. And the reasons they cite for this is because you have a data platform engineering team. They become a bottleneck because they just don't know enough about what the business units need. And then you have one centralized, lumbering, large data pipeline that reduces feature development or slows business velocity. So it just doesn't work. Instead, what they suggest that the data platform engineering team should think of themselves as creating standards. And the standards that they should create is around governance and metadata, data table formats, data discoverability, things like that, so that the data domain teams are empowered themselves. So the real shift here is that the platform engineering team becomes a team that lets the domain data team self-serve their data infrastructure, and then they own their warehouse, they own their pipelines, and ultimately they're the ones that can create their own data sets. So sounds nice. I think there's a lot of heated debate happening in Twitter and Substack, and the reasons for that was because it was really far-reaching. We're talking about people, process, and technology, and it was almost philosophical in a lot of ways and tactical, how the debates unfolded. And there were some skeptics, because before we had the modern data stack, before we decided to centralize all of our data in the cloud in one warehouse, we did have these fiefdoms. We had different teams with their own tools. Their data was very, very siloed. And it was really hard, actually, to get work done because you had no shared context. So people are kind of split. Like, how do you get a data mesh to work? So the benefits where you can have speed and velocity, but you don't give up all of the really clear, obvious benefits of where we've come so far, which is centralizing data in a singular place really does have a lot of benefits.
Yeah, right on. You know, that makes me think about what Tristan said at the keynote in New Orleans on Tuesday about both speed and accuracy at the same time. And it feels like for a long time we've had to pick where along this axis you want to be. Do you care more about accuracy or more about speed? And I think the promise of the data mesh is that you can get both of those things by centralizing control over, you know, the core parts of the data platform, and then sometimes we hear about it as a hub and spoke model. So you have these spokes that reach out into different parts of the business where you can go a lot deeper and be a lot more flexible. But you don't really want to be super flexible on number of customers or annual recurring revenue. Like, there should be one central team that kind of knows what that number is, right?
Totally. I think the hard part here is, like, it's right for different sizes of companies. So almost always, we heard a story earlier today about how the OnDeck team got started with their modern data stack. You know, they're thinking about a singular data store. It makes a lot of sense to centralize that information in one place. But maybe at a certain scale, not exactly sure when that is, you have to reconsider some of your primitives and assumptions so that it can work for really, really large teams. And so what we've observed, I think, with working customers and users from really small data teams all the way up to really, really large data teams, the data mesh seems to not resonate as much when you're at a certain stage of company, but when you're talking about teams where you have like thousands of analytics engineers or analysts that you have to support, that's when you need to come up with a more durable framework so that your platform engineering team can support the business units.
And I would say that's kind of the view I see working with a lot of our larger customers this has to be a resource initiative, right? This isn't without complexity. You're creating kind of more nodes and more relationships, and maybe we'll talk about data contracts too. But essentially, you're creating ownership relationships that have to be upheld for this to actually work, right? And so as soon as nodes start failing, I love the philosophy of it, but it does increase complexity, no? I mean, so what are kind of the weak spots we're seeing here? Is this something that we should only consider implementing for 1,000 data users or more, or what's kind of the guideline that we're seeing?
I think that's right. Like, yeah. I don't know. I don't have a magic number for you to say, like, at a certain scale you should consider the data mesh. But it reminds me a lot about some of the trends in like software engineering, where we moved away from big monolithic applications to microservices, because what we figured out in software engineering is that at a certain scale, having one code base with one database just fundamentally didn't work. So if you wanted to have like better speed, development, velocity, you split up the different services and then they spoke to each other via APIs, and you had better quality apps and also just easier to maintain and build them. You don't actually need to do that at a certain smaller size of building an application. Like, you actually start out in a monolith because you want to figure out product market fit. It's much easier to get going more quickly. And so I think the parallels are actually fairly strong, that monoliths don't necessarily equal bad. That's not right at all. When you get started, you start with a monolith and eventually you break it up into microservices.
Yeah, I like that approach. I think the general sentiment I'm seeing kind of in the community and amongst our customer base is to take the components that work for you of data mesh and introduce them slowly and with confidence is kind of the sentiment I'm seeing, but excellent. I like that one. Anything else to say? Otherwise, I'd say we delve into kind of a subset of data mesh, so kind of a natural conclusion. And Drew, I think this is actually a tweet from you.
Oh, I did this
And we had some pretty big news as a company that you presented with us, the semantic layer. So kind of curious to just start at the top. Why is that going to be really important? What are we covering with that? Why are we centralizing this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's also one of my better tweets. If you like that, you know where to find me. Yeah, so I think this term came onto my radar, the idea of a semantic layer, I think around the middle of last year. But as a concept, it's a very, very old and foundational concept in analytics and data broadly. In the past, this sort of thing was represented as what you would call an OLAP cube, online analytics processing. The idea was there are certain metrics that you need to very precisely define and report on with exact consistency everywhere. And so there's a trade-off between the amount of flexibility that you have and how you report on this number and how precisely you can define it. So the OLAP cube kind of sheds flexibility, but it gives you a lot of precision. You can very precisely define revenue, and then you store that aggregated revenue in a table. You say on this month in this country, we had this much revenue. And so you never have to calculate that number again. It's already been calculated. So little flexibility, high precision. At the other end of the spectrum, you could open your BI tool and write a really long SQL query, and that's really high flexibility and potentially very low precision. And so the semantic layer is kind of an answer to the question, how do you get the best of both worlds? And in the approach that we're taking, what we try to do is leverage the really great parts of DBT that help bring reason to data modeling. So version control, testing, code review, CI, CD. Try to bring that to the metrics part of data, which historically DBT has never done. DBT could build your fact and dimension tables, and then you could join them together and calculate revenue in your BI tool. But now there's logic that lives in one BI tool that might be different than logic that lives in a different BI tool, or it lives in one report but not another. And sort of what we've identified is for a metric like revenue or number of customers or churn rate, whatever it is, you want to see these numbers everywhere. And so you want to be able to have one definition for those metrics and then query it from all the different tools that you use. That's the high-level primer, I think, on semantic layers I would give.
Yeah, I think that it triggers almost an allergic reaction in my head to this case we had in my last company where there was a hot debate around the customer start date. So was it when they signed the contract? Was it when they started using the service? Was it when the first user was on the service? So that, to me, that's this perfect example of that lived in BI tools with different interpretations or in Confluence or documented somewhere. And it was so hard to have a discussion about it within the company because everybody saw it as a different thing, right?
Totally. And if you're successful, your company and product will grow and evolve. And so even if you get to a definition, you launch a new product and now it's different. Now the way that you calculate active users is different because there's a new product to use.
I think it's more than that though, because the modern data stack is moving well beyond just dashboards. So what we're seeing today is the modern data stack is powering applications, we're seeing it in notebooks, we're seeing it show up in our SaaS apps, we're piping data back. And so the metrics layer, the semantic layers that we've been most familiar with have been tightly coupled to your visualization layer in the past. It's what you've interacted with Looker and Tableau and Power BI and so forth. But because we are at a place now where the data that we store in our warehouses or lakehouses are finding their ways into a whole new, different kinds of contexts, it makes a lot more sense to move your semantic layer closer to where the data sits, closer to the DBT modeling layer is what we believe. And it's been this really hard chicken and egg problem for a very long time because as users, you want your metrics to show up wherever you're consuming them. And vendors have to do deep integrations to make that accessible and possible, and they sometimes want to wait to see, okay, well, who has this demand? And we're really at this spot now with the journey of DBT. We have 14,000 active companies using DBT every week that we feel yes, we see this demand, and we're making our first step into the market and saying, we're going to support the semantic layer. We launched a handful of partner integrations earlier this week, but I think that we'll see a whole lot more context for where your metrics will show up, and it will really change how we think about really data platforms, right? It's not just going to be for dashboarding and reporting. We'll see it in a whole lot of different ways as well.
Actually, that's a good thing I wanted to touch on, just in case people missed the keynote from yesterday, the day before, with the different partner integrations and everything. What's on the tactical side? How can this be leveraged immediately, or where are we in the journey?
Oh yeah. So there was a big crew of people in New Orleans at the keynote. There was lights and music, and I was in my hotel room in Westminster flipping on a feature flag on Tuesday that made the semantic layer in public preview. So if you use dbt Cloud, you can actually turn this on for your environments today. And it's not a thing that really makes sense in isolation. You need to experience your semantic relationships in a data tool or in a BI tool in many cases. So we're integrating with Mode Analytics. Hex is a very cool notebook style product. ThoughtSpot, who's here and sponsoring, is involved. Atlin for data cataloging, and really a host of other what we call metrics-ready partners too, that can integrate with dbt's understanding of metrics and help get these consistent metric definitions into other tools that you might use for data quality or things like that. So this is much more the beginning than the end of the journey for us. As Julia mentioned, it's a real cold start at play. One funny anecdote I can share with you is that about a year and a half ago, a bunch of heads of product and CEOs got together on Zoom every Thursday, and it was called the Metrics Super Friends Group. And in 4 meetings, we did it absolutely nothing. It was fun to hang out, but kind of a big waste of time. The thing that really impressed upon me was these BI tools really wanted a universal semantic layer that they could piggyback on top of. Because a BI tool doesn't want your first experience to be go define revenue for the 17th time today. They want to tap into something that already exists, that is trusted, and then they want to help you understand that data and do something different with that data. Take an action, internalize it differently, whatever it might be, correlate it. So I think the really cool thing about the semantic layer is it helps different products really shine and do what they're great at.
Yeah.
It's you don't need to define revenue in 10 different tools, and it's sort of an anti-pattern to try to.
No, I like it. That's a great introduction. So, and like Drew said, that's available to try out. I think we kind of have it in a bit of a public preview mode,
that's
right?
right?
We want to get feedback on how it's working for people and where they can utilize it. So please check that out and let us know what you think. Good. So kind of the next topic that's coming down from data mesh, or this is all, data mesh is kind of this conglomerate of old topics or kind of existing topics that help us, right? But data contracts, I mentioned it earlier, and it's kind of this thing I hear now and then that philosophically sounds fantastic, that I find really hard to envision the real world implementation of it, or how it works, or how it does not fail all the time. Julia, maybe you want to tell it. Does this really work? Is this something that people see? Is this a good idea? I don't know.
This is the buzziest topic of the moment. I feel like my Twitter has blown up around data contracts in the past couple months. And just so everyone's on the same page, what is a data contract? Start with some definitions. It's just an agreement between a data producer and a data consumer to maintain your data tables and your schemas in a reliable way. And if they do need to change, they don't do so in an unintended or unexpected way so that it doesn't break things downstream. And I think there's a lot of debate that unfolded because there's a lot of sources in a company for producing data. You can get it from a vendor, if someone's giving you an API or a data table, usually they're pretty good at letting you know if your table is going to change shape. They give you a heads up in documentation, they send emails, they're good at that. But people and process internally at companies often are terrible at telling you when they're going to break your data. And so either it's a manual process that your sales ops team or your marketing team has created, but really the software engineers are particularly bad. And it's not that they're malicious or anything, it's just they have their own priorities, and when they are making changes to their production application and it means database migration, you know who they're not thinking about? Their friends in data. They're just not thinking about them. And so inevitably they make a change, a dashboard breaks, or maybe something worse, like a model that was really important that fed into a machine learning model that drives a lot of revenue for the business breaks. And the data team is always on the hook. They're always the face of data quality problems. They get the first phone call and get asked, like, what happened? And so even though it might not be their fault or they weren't responsible for it, they're on the hook and they have to fix things ASAP. So data contracts is really like a plea from the data team to others in the business organization to please stop breaking their shit. Sounds really nice, but it's hard. It's really difficult because there's a lot of questions about, well, is that a real fair burden to put on your software engineering team to have to think about all these other things downstream that happen every single time they make a change? Like, they also have their own velocity challenges that they're dealing with. And so the debate about data contracts is, well, if it is a fair burden to put on the software engineering team, what kind of merits that level of importance for data? How do you select which types of tables do you want to keep and persist and make sure that your schemas don't change in unexpected ways? And then how do you enforce it? Because contracts are really they're nothing unless you can figure out how to enforce them, ideally before you break things, but if not, as soon as things start going bad, how do you get alerted really quickly and get to a stable state?
I think this and kind of the overall data mesh idea is so interesting because it's like trying to, they're kind of movements or topics that represent a cultural change, right? So we're trying to implant kind of data drivenness or data importance into a company's DNA sometimes after the fact. And data contracts is one of those ways to kind of will that into existence. At the same time, what I remember struggling with is when do you, and I think we're talking theoretically up here, so I'd be really interested to hear from the audience on this one. But when in the development process do you, like if it's a software company that's developing and a product and the product needs to emit events, when do you create this data contract? How often does it change? And there's another thing to own, right? And so it's again not without complexity, even though both parties need this SLA from each other. So that's kind of a call out that I'd be really interested to hear how that's supposed to work, or do we do it internally, or what?
It's a good question. First, I want to advocate for the developers who were so wrongly disparaged just moments ago.
Shots fired.
Shots fired.
Yes.
No, completely hear where you're coming from. I will say, I think in data, especially if we're operating in a sort of ETL paradigm, it's very easy to see a table in Snowflake that was replicated from the production database, to start using that in a DBT model, to build a dashboard on top of it, and to never actually tell the engineers responsible for that part of the product that that's a very significant data point that the executive dashboard relies on. So like you said, the contract goes both ways. It's both, hey, engineers, we really need this. If you change it, it's going to break our stuff. It's also like, hey, data team, like we're gonna commit to maintaining it. So I don't know, the thing that I've seen, in fact, I'm gonna do a shout out. Remy is here in the front row. Remy and I used to work together at 8 Tracks when I thought I was gonna be a web developer in college. And we implemented event tracking systems together. And we did a pretty good job. What we didn't do so much was replicate a database directly to Redshift and use that data. We had events that sort of represented a thing that had happened. And so I think that's the kind of contract that you do want to create for these really crucial business processes. It's like, rather than relying on a table that really is intended to support the application, some sort of application outcome, whatever it is, you can actually build an abstraction like an event that you track that says, Drew bought new pants to go to London because his old ones were ripped. You can track that semantic information. And then if the business logic should change in the future, it's kind of okay because the table can evolve in whatever way the table needs to evolve for the application. You can keep hitting that same event schema kind of target. So to me, I think data contracts and events are kind of like inextricably linked.
Yeah, I like that framing because I think another part of the debate is, are these contracts consumer-led or producer-led? And in the way you've described it, is the producer just says, hey, I'm going to maintain this kind of business logic that everyone else is going to interface and consume from. And if they need to change things behind the scene, they are just providing an abstraction layer, which makes things a little bit easier.
The one open question I have here that I still can't quite wrap my head around, and I think this goes back to kind of the data domains of data mesh, is what happens for data consumers that aren't the data producer? Or so you're going to have maybe a business domain that needs to consume data but isn't going to be the producers of this data. So they're going to rely on kind of another contract within the company to be able to be unblocked, right? So how would that work?
Yeah. You know, I think there are a lot of similarities between the data mesh concept and sort of the data contracts also concept, we'll say, but to me, like, data contracts feels a lot more implementable. It's like, I can imagine how you could write unit tests in code around the nature of the event that you're going to track. So, like, software engineers are very good at not breaking applications in most cases. Product managers are very good at understanding requirements, and there are often requirements for marketing or for sales. And I can't think of a reason why data shouldn't also provide requirements that, you know, the engineering team is responsible for building towards. And so if you do that, you know, it's take any API, you know, if you make a breaking change to the API, downstream consumers are going to have a bad day.
It's like an API spec and a change log kind of. No?
Exactly.
No.
And if the ability to version them, I think, is really powerful. So you can say, well, version 1 of a transaction is this, and we're going to keep publishing that for the next 6 months, but it's officially deprecated, and you should start using version 2. So now you're giving people an upgrade path onto, like, you know, newer, richer information, whatever it might be. And you can sort of support the evolution of these schemas without breaking people's.
So we've got versioned data contracts. That's the next Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people are worried about with data contracts is it like ossifies the business. Like, once you have a particular schema or you have a data in a certain shape, like, data contract says I can't change that shape or else I've broken the contract. That's not really what the contract is set up to do. The contract instead just says if you do need to change the schema or you do need to drop a table, you have to give upfront notice so that people aren't left scrambling. And so I think you can find these like really good middle paths where it works for both the producer and the consumer, but you have to be really discerning on what merits a data contract, because of course if you have, you know, thousands in your organization, it probably gets pretty unwieldy very quickly.
Some great conversation going on in the Slack right now that we can come back to once we've gotten through our topics. But this one's definitely popular.
If you want to shout it out now, we could do that too. It's up to you.
Yeah,
it's your show, Nick. We're just here as props for that.
I mean, the other topics are good too. I don't want to neglect those.
All right.
There's there's one good comment, Denitsa. I've always seen data contracts through the lens of joint ownership and an end-to-end attitude about data. More win-win-win for engineering, data, and the org as a whole. Less about breaking and more about what you want to get out of the data for yourself and the organization.
Oh yeah.
I like that.
That's a really good comment. I think data
So
contracts.
we'd love to hear if that's too outlandish.
No, I don't think so. I think data contracts are, I will say, obviously a good idea. Like, get all of your stakeholders to get on the same page about the data that needs to be produced and how it's consumed and exactly the business purpose, not tied to the implementation. Fantastic idea. It's just like very hard to do for everything in practice all the time.
It's, maybe some hand-holding and some stakeholder management, but I think spelling out the consequences of what happens when it's not upheld is just this important thing for business value, right?
We were actually talking about this last night. We just go out to dinner, we talk about data contracts, like not preparing, it came up. And the question we asked is, suppose something's broken in production and the engineering team needs to make an emergency fix to like a table, they're gonna run a migration. If they break the data contract, they can fix the application. What's their priority in that scenario? And I don't think that's exactly about data contracts, but it is a question about, what do you really value as a team, and how important is the data relative to the functioning of the application? And I don't think there's one answer, for every company. It certainly is a spectrum. But I would say in our organization, we'd fix production before we maintain the data contract. And that's just a statement about, priorities, I think.
We have another hot take on data contracts, and I think this is about what you were saying. Data teams should stop replicating production databases and consume data via API instead. Problem solved.
We're done.
That's Julian, and then product responds. A lot of data is simply never exposed via an API, but it's still necessary for internal analytics. That's gotten a lot of pluses. And then Boxy Sean writes that he dreams of API endpoints for data defined in DBT YAML files. All right, a lot of hot takes
We'll
there.
tell Boxy Sean about the semantic layer after we jump off. No, those are all really, really good points.
They are. I think we have to move on to the next topic and come back to this, because now Slack is really exploding. I'm glad you've all woken up. Thank you. The last one that I think is pretty cool is that Alex Higgs writes, a DBT exposure is a form, or at least the tip of a data contract, no?
Yeah.
That
I
is
think so.
exactly how I would interpret that. That's awesome. All right, next topic. This one probably also deserves some of our time. The unbundling of the data stack, or the unbundling of Airflow. Maybe Drew, I'll let you kind of just take this away and explain what we're talking about here for a second.
Yeah, I'm glad this is no longer on trend. It felt like every tweet I saw was about bundle this, unbundle that, and I think there's a really good conversation to be had in there, especially one of these tweets is about Airflow, right?
Yeah, one is the unbundling of Airflow.
Yeah,
I mean, what are we even talking about there?
What are we talking about?
What was Airflow?
Bundling.
Was it our monolith, or what's going on?
Yeah, so there was a time before data warehouses, and if you wanted to get a lot of data into one place and then apply some sort of business logic to it and then visualize it, you would buy a product, and the one product would do all of that for you in many cases. And this was convenient. You log into one place, you see everything all together. There's a sort of coherence that you can create if you have one product that does everything. And the thing that has sort of changed over the past, we'll say, 7 or 8 years is the advent of the data warehouse. That's very good at just storing data and then analytically querying that data. And so this sort of disrupted that whole model of the all-in-one BI tool, and it led to an approach where you have one product for data storage, you have different products for data visualization. It requires other products still to get data into the data warehouse from your different data sources. You might have a multitude of those products because you have a variety of different data sources, as well as homegrown Python scripts. And so you've taken this all in one thing, and it now is 7 different things. And the benefit of having 7 different things is that those are the 7 best-in-class things for solving the problem that you have, whether it's loading data or querying data or visualizing it. The downside is you have 7 products, and you have to talk to 7 different salespeople and administrate 7 different tools, And that's there's a real cost to that. I would argue, DBT is of course one of these things that gets unbundled, in this scenario. I would argue the benefits of having the best of breed data stack, where you use tools that are good at a smaller thing, very good at that and focused, outweighs the cost of being unbundled. But the conversation that happened, I think, over the past year about this was, are there too many products? Is it too hard to assemble it? Do we need to buy 10 different products to get started with data? Which isn't necessarily, I think, a fair characterization, but that's how the conversation took place.
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges, Airflow is a very powerful tool, and so people use it to do lots of different things. And they use it both often for orchestration and also for execution, so doing tasks. You do a lot of your moving data from different sources to your data warehouse, all in Airflow. Then you have your transformation, use DBT, you can do it in Airflow. Then you also have your reverse ELs, and so people did a lot of execution alongside their orchestration all in Airflow. And that sometimes became pretty messy for people because when things broke inevitably, as they always do, it was really hard to discern like what was the root cause or how to fix it. And so what we had pop up are these like tools that were really good at doing their individual tasks very, very well. And you got these like QA economies of scale. And so now not every single team on Earth needs to figure out how to move data from Salesforce into Snowflake. You just, call an API or click a button and it happens. And I think that's generally a very good thing for the ecosystem, but we still have to think about orchestration, how everything fits together so you have more workflows and you don't have to constantly think about 7 tools. You're thinking about a problem that I need to solve and it just happens. One of the things I'm super interested in is like how do we make the conversation around orchestration easier? Like it still takes a really long time to know like where is my data? Is it updated? How do I trigger these next few tasks that need to happen? When these problems generally aren't that interesting, like I wish all of it just happened a lot more easily for people.
Yeah, to kind of also put that one to the audience is I'd love to hear in Slack if this resonates with you all. Do you feel like you have too many tools in your stack? Do you feel like that's complex to maintain? Or is everything still in Airflow?
So we stopped doing the show of hands, but I'm wondering, like, who used Airflow 3 years ago? Okay, who uses Airflow today?
Well, different hands.
Different hands, and about the same number.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, good one. I'd move on to the next topic. Talking about open data formats. So maybe I do another show of hands because this was always one that confused me. But who would say the pronunciation of the word, the data format, parquet or parquet? Who would say parquet? Who would say parquet? I would say parquet. So maybe this was a case of a word that I'd always only read and never pronounced, but I said parquet for a very long time.
Okay. It's a good question. All right, next topic.
That was it? The open data format? No. So why is this important?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually have Matej here backstage to talk about it. Matej, come on. Oh, I have to talk about it? Okay. Mostly kidding. This is not my area of expertise. And so if there are people in the audience that spend a lot of time working with these tools, would love to hear from you at the end or on Slack. If you take a database, we'll say data warehouse, data platform, Redshift, Snowflake, BigQuery, these products have internal specifications for how they store data. So when you load a table into Snowflake, it's going to store it in its own proprietary format. Redshift will do the same thing. And you can think of that format as being basically like a CSV file. The difference is it's optimized for the types of queries that you run on the data warehouse, but you need to store some sort of file somewhere that says like, this is the data, these are the columns, these are the rows. And so what has happened over the past, we'll say, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, but especially recently, is we've seen new types of formats, both for storing, we'll say, data in files, and then also tables in files. And so when we talk about data formats and kind of table formats in particular, the idea is how do we represent everything that the database would know about a table, but do so in a way that the file specification is open source, and you can build different tools that can interoperate with these different file formats. So this is a really powerful concept, because now you can imagine deeply separating the storage of the data from computation that happens on top of that data. So you're not super locked into one data platform. If you take a file format like Parquet, that could live on S3. You could query it from BigQuery over in GCP, and there's really no problem doing that. It's a well understood format. It's not proprietary. So the new table format is Iceberg. And my understanding of Iceberg is that, well, do you want to?
No, I think there are a few new table formats. There's Delta from Databricks. There's Hoodie, which came from Uber, and then Iceberg, which came from Netflix. And I think we have a few options to pick from for different table formats. And the cool thing, I think the big innovations that are coming from these table formats is you're getting a lot of warehouse-like functionality. which you just didn't have before. So you would expect in your warehouse to be able to do things like schema evolution or time travel, partition your data. Now these table formats really feel much more like how you would interact with Table and Snowflake in your warehouse. And the cool thing that I think you were getting to is that you can mix and match. So you can pick the best tool for the job. And we used to have, a decade ago, it was really cool. We separated storage from compute in a single vendor, Databricks and Snowflake, BigQuery, they all did this, and it was fantastically exciting that you could scale up and scale down as you needed. But now you can do that in completely different technologies and vendors. So I've heard actually this referred to as almost like the headless warehouse, because you're just talking about the storage layer, not the query layer. And you can mix and match Spark and Trino and Presto with different table formats like Iceberg, Hoodie, and Delta. And I actually think pretty cool too, Snowflake made an announcement earlier this year that they were going to be investing in it and trying to make Iceberg feel very native. So you don't have to move your data from wherever it's sitting into Snowflake to be able to query it. You now have a really native experience when you're using Iceberg tables. I think we'll see a lot more new use cases evolve that reduce the actual movement of data and increase data sharing.
Okay, so this is a win for all of us who want to use data without spending too much time moving it into the right place or cloud provider.
I think it's kind of transparently a win, because whether you know that it's happening or not, if your data warehouse can support querying Iceberg tables, that's just a capability that you now have. And if you can export your data to Iceberg or a Hoodie or Delta, then great, you can interoperate with that using other databases or other products too, other tools. So it doesn't really cost anything. It's just like pure flexibility, and that's kind of nice.
Just a trend that we profit from, right?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
No downsides.
No downside.
Just trying to make like
There's
an
probably a downside.
open source, like, no, Nick, we don't profit from it. It's open source.
No.
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
benefit
in our
from it.
time savings,
Absolutely.
right, and maybe frustration savings and things like that. General profits. Good. Let's touch on one last topic, and then we'll open it up for questions. There's already some good stuff in Slack. This one, data apps. I'm actually going to read this tweet because it describes it well from Pedram. Have you ever built a data app on top of the data warehouse, either an internal tool or a whole external-facing application? This one's kind of near and dear to my heart because I wanted to do this so many times and never quite got past like the director of engineering to implement this with DBT. But so is that just the definition of a data app, and why is this an evolution, or what's happening to make this kind of possible?
Yeah, so I think data apps, like people understand what data is, people understand what apps are, but what makes a data app different from a regular application? For me, it's if you're answering yes to these two questions, is it primarily built, owned, maintained by the data team, and is it on a stack that we would call maybe the modern data stack that's similarly maintained by those people? And if the answer to those two questions are yes, then we have a data app. And I remember last year at Coalesce, Emily Hawkins at Drizzly, she was talking about how she combined Materialize, which is a real-time database, with DBT to power in-app analytics for Drizzly, where when people were checking out, they would offer them a discount or some product savings, all within the application of Drizzly. And I was thinking, wow, this is so cool, using tools that are very, very familiar to us to do analytical workloads. We now see it being customer-facing and clearly driving some business ROI. So to me, that was the pinnacle of like, wow, we're really changing the horizon of what we can do with our data stack and the tools that we have. And we're able to have this conversation, I think, primarily because data teams are working much more similarly to software engineers, and they've figured out things like version control, testing, documentation, CI, data contracts, having good observability, alerts, all these things that you need to maintain production systems we now are working in much better ways that we can stand behind our applications, and the data quality is much, much better than it's ever been before. So I think data apps is really exciting. I think there's also some pretty cool technologies that are enabling new data experiences. So I mentioned Materialize, but there's a whole host of new databases like Rockset, ClickHouse that allow for much faster analytical workloads. DuckDB seems to be all the rage these days for in-process analytical workflows on a single node. So now you can power it on a mobile phone or using your laptop, all browser side. I think these innovations will really transform the way that the whole world works with data, and we'll see it in like user-facing, production-like contexts.
Yeah, super nice. I think so. Just to summarize before we move on to some questions. So what's kind of happened that enables this is that the foundation for a production system is now available, right? So we've kind of upped our game as in the data systems world, and now we could actually rely on that to provide some sort of SLA for an actual application for folks to use, right?
Yeah, and the way we work. I think that's like a really key component too, because I know we had this conversation about like a different system internally, and to maintain software that's production, like you have often people who are on call, or you have to be ready for inevitably when you have scaling cliffs. You don't always anticipate how something that's user-facing, how users use your product, and you have to prepare for that by kind of having the right anti-fragile workflows in place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, everyone wants to put stuff in production until the on-call rotation gets rolled out. You're like, I'm just on the data team. I do the dashboards.
I work normal hours.
Yeah, I enjoy my weekends. So you're so right. There's a tremendous amount of tooling that, like, not even data-specific tooling. Like, just if you're building an application, you plug in a log monitoring, alerting tool, and it plugs into PagerDuty. And okay, we need to like get more advanced, I think, in how we use those tools for data. If data warehouses are going to power our applications, but kind of leaving that complexity aside, the thing you touched on is really the most exciting part of data apps to me, which is like not an app entirely built on top of data, but an app that helps you perform some process at work. Like it's a customer support tool, or it's a performance marketing, like advertising tool. And these things can plug into your data warehouse and show you in context, data from not just that tool, but other related data. So you're in a performance marketing tool and it tells you, these are all the customers that signed up because of this campaign that you ran last month. And that came from your data warehouse, and it was enriched with information about what they did in your product and how long it took them to convert from their trial, things like that. So now we're blending the operational part of it, like I want to run a campaign, with the data context part of it. Just like, why does this matter? Who does it affect? And that's pretty hard to achieve today. In fact, for the most part, if you want to do it, you end up using a reverse ETL tool. Did we cut slide 7?
I think we did actually. I think that's the end of the data trends, but that's the clicker doesn't go anymore.
Yeah, that's okay.
But that's important because we actually have a bunch of things to tackle in Slack. So maybe we take a little from Slack, and then we could also ask the audience if anybody just has any ad hoc questions. Bear with me because there's a bunch of stuff that has been said. Oh, this one's for you, Drew. So Drew said that some key business concepts should be owned by a certain team, but that actually goes against the domain-driven purpose of the data mesh, which I don't think we knew. But is it possible to work by domain with DBT, each with their own repository, but at the same time having the possibility to share or reuse models?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. I think you can approximate it today, but we sort of recognize that it's not a great experience, and I think we want to fix that.
How will we do it with packages, or?
Yeah, you can do it with packages today. That'd be challenging. The other thing you can do is just treat another team's kind of like leaf nodes in their DAG as your source nodes in a sense. Yep. The problem with doing that is you lose lineage, and the lineage that DBT provides is like really valuable. And so breaking your mega DAG up into these smaller unrelated DAGs like not really desirable. So yeah, the idea of reusing logic is, the best way to avoid getting something wrong is to just define it once. So if you can reuse models or reuse logic, that feels really valuable. And I have never once claimed that I'm a data mesh expert, and I apologize to you all, and I apologize to the data mesh learn
These are
Twitter
hot
account,
takes.
which blocked me.
Oh, they did. Yeah. Sorry.
They're hot takes. We're just trying to garner a common understanding
Just gonna
for
react
Jordan,
to it.
Another interesting question for the panel. I regularly mentor students coming out of university with a degree in data science, and none of them are aware of DBT. Are we doing anything on that front, or are you, us? DBT is the first thing I ask all the students to learn immediately.
That's so cool.
Well, I think it's two things there. One, maybe data science, or are we talking like what tools are they using? Are they SQL-based? Are they Python-based? We are seeing more polyglot teams. We think that we should expand into those personas as well. That was certainly a big step we took this week with launching Python and DBT so that different people who have different needs for tools can work together and collaborate more. But I think one of the other really cool things that we've seen earlier this year is we actually have seen some universities bringing DBT into their classrooms, and we have these really cool, like 1,000 students signing up for DBT cloud accounts to just learn the basics of analytics engineering, and we'd love to see more of that. I think we have to find some partners and start people young. Like, we need to change how they think about how do you collaborate and work with data so that when they enter the workforce, they have some good ideas on how to do that.
Hey, so that's a phenomenal point. If you want to write data science or DBT for babies, like we could collaborate on that. If anyone can illustrate.
Start them really young.
I studied computer science in college, and I took some data classes. And if you're doing data science at the undergrad level, at least where I went to school, you're getting a CSV of like irises and sepal lengths, and it's just like, cool, that's a great way to learn the underlying statistics and get familiar with the tools, but it's not actually a context in which DBT makes any sense. And you don't like need a lineage graph of like the 3 Python like pandas data frames operations that you do. So I really think we need to introduce like the concept of business processes that are evolving that you need to manage, and you're collaborating with a big team. And if we could replicate that environment with something like a data warehouse, then DBT immediately makes a lot of sense. But without that broader context, it's like not actually value additive.
That's a great point. Great questions coming up. I really like this one. So as I'm listening to these hot topics, it makes me wonder. With all these different trends and strong opinions on how to do things, it's increasingly difficult for companies and individuals new to the data stack to just simply get started. There's a ton of jargon that even keen people don't even know what they should be researched. So much jargon that not even people who are interested want to know what they should be researching. So many SaaS offerings also have a really high entry point, which means small companies with limited funding are left dramatically behind. What's being done to be able to help these, or what do you recommend to start the journey?
Oh gosh, it's just so true. Like everyone has inside jokes and jargons. I'd say the first thing I'll say is the data community I find to be one of the most welcoming and friendly group of people that I've ever been able to be a part of. So just ask questions. I think people are very willing to mentor and help. I do a podcast every week, so it's kind of a plug. But we try to break it down and talk about like what are the definitions, like how to understand these trends. There are really great Substacks that you can follow. I'll give another plug for Ben Stansel's. He really cuts into the meat of a lot of like debates that are happening in data and breaks it down. He'll also give you about 50 links. So leave a lot of time to read his articles because you end up just on this like long trail of information. But I do think we need to do a better job of like just basic glossary so that we're all on the same page. I try to do my part when I can, but there's definitely improvements to be had.
Actually can speak to my own journey there a little bit. I was at a conference like this, and there was a speaker who really resonated with me, and I liked the topic, and afterwards I asked that person to just be my mentor and take a call with me every 8 weeks or so to guide me a little bit. That company was a little bit further in their journey than ours was, and I was really starting the analytics function. And something like that, that person was also part of the DBT community, and I knew that, and that was kind of what let my guard down to actually ask. But that kind of relationship, I think, is pretty easy to build in our community, and that was a huge boon to understanding or wading through kind of all the information, because there is a lot of information now.
Hey, I don't have something super constructive to add, but I would say, if you can't discern what a product does, like, you probably don't need to think super hard about it. And here's another one. Raise your hand if you have a perfect data team where everything's going flawlessly and there's nothing you could improve. Okay. Get out of here. Actually, you come sit here, and I'm going to go take your seat.
Well, we did see a hand, but it was very quickly gone.
Yeah.
So that's also something.
It's like, there's a lot of these topics are how do you do better at scale? How do you make it more functional with, thousands of people, like, across data and stakeholders, and how do you do it better and faster and for cheaper? And these things are all very admirable, and it's also a moving target. And so a lot of these approaches are just that, like, it's an approach, it's an ideology, and you could choose to pursue it if it feels resonant. But if it doesn't feel right for your organization, or if you're having a hard time translating it into your context, might not be the thing that you need. So if you're truly just getting started, especially if you're like a data team of one trying to figure things out, if you have a functioning data practice, you are in the 90th percentile of companies in the world. Be proud of that. You don't need to add a lot up front.
Okay, so we've got a couple more minutes, maybe just one. This one I like because it didn't make our short list, but I think it's pretty valid. What happened to data catalogs? Are they left out in the cold?
They're alive and kicking. Reports of data catalogs' demise are...
Maybe there's just debates around data catalogs. I think everybody agrees they're a good idea.
It's a great idea, good products. I think,
there's definitely a number of modern data catalogs that we see people adopting and using, some open source ones too that you can get started with. I think people started talking about active metadata. We were talking about data contracts. One of the hardest parts too is a lot of times now it's not just your data team that needs to rely on the data catalog, but maybe your software engineering team, or there's a business user that needs to have context for how this data is used. What's the lineage, or what do I need to know? What's the cheat sheet of information? So I think it's a pretty interesting space, and there's still a lot of work to be done with data catalogs.
I was pretty interested to see the integration with Atlan that we've done with the semantic layer, and also that a lot of these data catalogs are starting to use the DBT metadata to actually reverse engineer column level lineage. So a tool like Atlan, you can actually see what happened on a column level all the way through. I thought that was pretty cool.
Somebody earlier on Slack asked about column level lineage. Check out Atlan if you...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a long requested feature that I think maybe is one of those things that we're not going to touch because other people are touching it so nicely.
It's my white whale.
It's your white whale.
My white whale someday.
Maybe we have time for one. I don't know who's governing us. Do we have to go?
I don't want to go.
It's blinking. I don't know.
I know. I'm having a good time.
We're negative. Yeah, we got to get out of here.
We're way over. Okay, look. Here's the deal. Approach us out on the floor, and we'll try to answer your questions. But we're actually a minute over time. Which is my governance duty. So that was part of my contract where I failed. But anyway, Drew, Julia, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you everyone for listening, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Nick.